The morning sun cast long shadows across the crystal towers of Zephyria Prime. Dr. Veltar Quinn walked slowly through the halls of the Academy of Sciences, his forearms carrying data tablets filled with failed calculations. At 200 years old, he had spent his entire adult life working on the same problem. The convergence equation. The equation sat before him on a massive holographic display, its symbols glowing blue against the dark wall. 17 variables twisted and turned in complex patterns that hurt to look at for too long. This was no ordinary math problem. If solved, it would give the Zephyrians the power to travel faster than light without needing the rare materials that other races required. Veltar touched one of the symbols with his long finger. The display zoomed in, showing thousands of smaller calculations branching out like the roots of a tree. Each branch represented years of work by the smartest minds on Zephyria Prime. Each branch led to a dead end. Still no progress? Asked Dr. Mirith Sek, entering the chamber with her own collection of data tablets. She was younger than Veltar, only 150 years old, but she had been working on the equation for most of her life too. The quantum computers ran all night, Veltar replied, his voice tired. They tested another 1,000,000 combinations. Nothing worked. The two scientists stood in silence, staring at the equation that had consumed their civilization for 3 centuries. Other races had learned to bend space and time through brute force, using massive amounts of energy or exotic matter that cost fortunes to produce. But the Zephyrians believed there had to be a better way, a pure mathematical solution that would unlock the secrets of faster-than-light travel through elegance rather than force. Maybe we should try a different approach, Mirith H. suggested, though she had made this suggestion countless times before. We have tried every approach, Veltar said, gesturing to the walls lined with mathematical proofs. We have divided the equation into segments. We have assigned teams to each variable. We have built computers specifically designed to handle these calculations. We have explored 47 different theoretical frameworks. The Academy's approach was methodical and precise. Every calculation was checked and double-checked. Every hypothesis was tested from every possible angle. The Zephyrians took pride in their systematic way of thinking. They believed that with enough time and careful analysis, any problem could be solved. In the distance, an alarm chimed softly. Veltar looked at his communication device and saw a message from the Planetary Council. A human ship was approaching Zephyria Prime. The humans had only recently achieved basic space travel and had been making contact with various alien species across the galaxy. The humans are arriving today, Veltar told Mirith. The Council wants us to give them a tour of the Academy. Mirith H. made a sound that was the Zephyrian equivalent of a laugh. What could they possibly understand about our work? Their mathematics are primitive compared to ours. They have barely learned to travel between stars. But Veltar was curious about these humans. Reports from other worlds described them as unpredictable and creative, but also reckless and illogical. They seemed to solve problems in ways that made no sense to more advanced civilizations. Yet somehow their solutions worked. The USS Endeavour appeared in the sky above the Academy, a small ship compared to the massive Zephyrian vessels. It looked rough and practical, built for function rather than beauty. As it landed in the Academy's courtyard, Veltar wondered what these strange creatures would make of the convergence equation. The ship's doors opened, and 3 humans emerged. Captain Jake Morrison was tall and confident, with graying hair and sharp eyes. Dr. Lisa Campbell looked younger, with brown hair tied back and the focused expression of a scientist. The 3rd human was different from the others. Tony Martinez wore a simple blue uniform and carried tools rather than data tablets. He looked around the Academy with wonder, as if he had never seen anything so beautiful. Welcome to Zephyria Prime, Veltar said, using the translation device to speak in human language. I am Dr. Veltar Quinn, head of the Mathematical Sciences Division. Captain Morrison stepped forward and shook Veltar's hand in the human custom. Thank you for having us. We're honored to visit your academy. As they walked through the halls, Veltar explained the history of Zephyrian science. He showed them the quantum computers that worked day and night, processing millions of calculations. He demonstrated their holographic displays that could show mathematical concepts in 3 dimensions. The humans seemed impressed, especially Dr. Campbell, who asked detailed questions about their methods. Tony Martinez stayed quiet during most of the tour, but his eyes were always moving, looking at everything with interest. When they reached the chamber containing the convergence equation, he stopped and stared at the massive display. What is that? He asked, pointing at the glowing symbols. That is our greatest challenge, Veltar replied. We call it the convergence equation. It is a mathematical formula that could revolutionize space travel, but we have been unable to solve it for 3 centuries. Dr. Campbell studied the equation with professional interest. It's incredibly complex. How many people have worked on it? Thousands, Mirith answered. The best minds of our civilization have dedicated their lives to this problem. We have tried every systematic approach we can think of. Tony Martinez continued to stare at the equation, his head tilted to one side. Can I get a copy of this? He asked suddenly. Veltar and Mirith exchanged glances. Are you a mathematician? Veltar asked. No, Tony replied. I fix engines. The Zephyrian scientists looked confused, but they agreed to provide a simplified version of the equation. As the humans prepared to return to their ship, Veltar felt a strange mixture of hope and doubt. These humans were so different from his people. Where Zephyrians were methodical, humans seemed chaotic. Where Zephyrians valued precision, humans seemed to value speed. But as Tony Martinez walked away, still looking at the copy of the equation, Veltar wondered if perhaps their different way of thinking might see something that centuries of Zephyrian logic had missed. The next 3 days would prove more interesting than anyone could have imagined. The USS Endeavour felt small and cramped after the vast halls of the Zephyrian Academy. Captain Jake Morrison sat in his quarters, reading reports about their hosts while Dr. Lisa Campbell worked at her desk nearby. The door chimed, and Tony Martinez entered, still carrying the paper copy of the convergence equation. That was some tour, Tony said, settling into a chair. Those aliens really know their math. They're incredibly advanced, Dr. Campbell agreed, not looking up from her computer screen. Their systematic approach to problem solving is remarkable. I've never seen anything like that equation they showed us. Captain Morrison closed his report and looked at Tony. You seemed pretty interested in their math problem. That's not usually your area. Tony shrugged. I don't know. Something about it looked familiar, but I can't put my finger on it. The next morning, the human delegation returned to Zephyria Prime for a formal presentation. The Academy's Great Hall was filled with hundreds of Zephyrian scientists, all eager to learn about human mathematics and science. Dr. Veltar Quinn introduced the humans to the assembled crowd. Our guests come from a young civilization that has only recently achieved interstellar travel, he said. But they represent a different way of thinking about the universe. Today, Dr. Campbell will share some of their mathematical techniques with us. Dr. Campbell stepped forward, feeling nervous under the gaze of so many brilliant minds. She had prepared a presentation about human approaches to theoretical physics, but she knew it would seem primitive compared to Zephyrian methods. She began by explaining how humans used intuition and pattern recognition to solve problems. We don't always follow systematic procedures, she said. Sometimes we make leaps of logic that we can't fully explain, but that lead us to correct answers. The Zephyrians listened politely, but she could see confusion in their large eyes. The idea of making logical leaps without systematic verification seemed to make them uncomfortable. "But how do you know your answers are correct?" asked Dr. Mireth Sek. "We test them," Dr. Campbell replied. "If they work, we use them. If they don't, we try something else." This answer seemed to disturb the Zephyrians even more. Their entire approach to science was based on proving things before using them, not the other way around. After the presentation, Dr. Veltar Quinn approached the human delegation. "Would you be interested in examining our convergence equation in more detail? We would be curious to see how human minds approach such a problem." Captain Morrison nodded. Dr. Campbell would be honored to take a look. They returned to the chamber where the equation was displayed. Dr. Campbell studied it carefully, asking questions about the various components and the methods the Zephyrians had used to develop it. "You've been incredibly thorough," she said. "Finally, I can see why this has been such a challenge. The level of complexity is staggering." "We have explored every systematic approach we can think of," Veltar explained. "We have divided the problem into manageable segments, assigned teams to each component, and used our most powerful computers to process the calculations." Tony Martinez had been listening quietly, but now he spoke up. "Can you explain what the equation is supposed to do?" Veltar looked surprised by the question. "It describes the mathematical relationship between space-time curvature and quantum field fluctuations. If solved correctly, it would allow us to create faster-than-light travel without exotic matter." "So it's about how space bends when you push on it with quantum energy?" Tony asked. "That is a very simplified way to put it," Veltar replied. Sounding slightly offended by the crude description, Dr. Campbell requested a complete copy of the equation to study during their 3-day visit. The Zephyrians agreed, providing her with detailed mathematical proofs and historical documentation of their attempts to solve it. That evening, back on the USS Endeavour, Dr. Campbell spread the equation across every screen in her quarters. Mathematical symbols seemed to dance before her eyes, forming complex patterns that twisted through multiple dimensions. She could see why the Zephyrians had struggled with it for so long. Meanwhile, Tony Martinez was in Engineering Bay 3, performing routine maintenance on the ship's quantum drive. It was quiet work that he had done thousands of times before, checking connections and calibrating field generators. During his lunch break, he sat at his small desk and pulled out the paper copy of the convergence equation. He wasn't trying to solve it. He was just curious about how it worked. As he looked at the symbols, he began to recognize patterns that reminded him of the quantum field readings he saw every day in the engine room. "Huh," he said to himself, pulling out a pencil. "This part looks like a harmonic resonance pattern." He began sketching on the back of his maintenance checklist, simplifying the complex mathematical notation into basic diagrams that made sense to him. Where the Zephyrians saw abstract mathematical concepts, Tony saw practical engineering problems that he dealt with every day. The quantum drive hummed quietly nearby, its field generators creating the same kinds of energy patterns that the equation was trying to describe. Tony had never thought about the mathematics behind those patterns before, but now he was beginning to see connections. "If this variable represents field strength," he muttered, making notes on his paper, "and this one represents frequency, then maybe this whole section is just describing how the fields interact with each other." 2 decks above, Dr. Campbell was struggling with the same systematic approach that had trapped the Zephyrians for centuries. She was looking for mathematically elegant solutions, trying to find the perfect theoretical framework that would unlock the equation's secrets. But Tony was thinking about the problem differently. He wasn't interested in mathematical elegance or theoretical frameworks. He just wanted to understand how the thing was supposed to work in practice. As he continued sketching on his maintenance checklist, he began to see something that the Zephyrians had missed. They had been treating the equation as a pure mathematical abstraction, but Tony saw it as a description of how real quantum fields behaved in the real world. And in the real world, things were often much simpler than they appeared on paper. The next morning, Dr. Campbell looked tired from staying up late with the equation. Captain Morrison found her in the mess hall, drinking coffee and staring at data tablets. "Any progress?" he asked. She shook her head. "It's incredibly complex. The Zephyrians have been right to approach it systematically. I can't see any obvious shortcuts." Tony Martinez entered the mess hall, carrying his maintenance checklist covered in sketches and calculations. He looked excited about something. "Dr. Campbell," he said, "I think I might have found something interesting about that equation." She looked up from her coffee, expecting to hear another amateur observation about the mathematics. But something in Tony's expression made her pay attention. "What did you find?" she asked. Tony sat down and spread his scrap paper on the table. "I think the Zephyrians have been making this problem harder than it needs to be." Dr. Lisa Campbell stared at Tony Martinez's scrap paper, trying to make sense of his rough sketches and simplified equations. The maintenance checklist was covered in pencil marks, with arrows connecting different parts of the convergence equation to basic diagrams that looked like something from a high school physics textbook. "I don't understand," she said. "What are these drawings supposed to represent?" Tony pointed to one of his sketches. "This is how the quantum fields behave in our ship's engine. See, when you apply energy at this frequency, the field creates this pattern." He traced his finger along a wavy line. "And that's exactly what this part of the equation is describing." Dr. Campbell looked more closely at his work. Tony had taken complex mathematical concepts and turned them into simple mechanical diagrams. Where the Zephyrians saw abstract theoretical frameworks, he saw practical engineering problems. "But Tony," she said gently, "this equation is much more complicated than engine maintenance. It involves 17 variables and quantum mechanics that we barely understand." "Maybe that's the problem," Tony replied. "Maybe we're making it too complicated." Dr. Campbell felt a familiar frustration. She had spent years studying advanced mathematics and theoretical physics, and now a maintenance engineer was suggesting that centuries of Zephyrian research was wrong. But something about Tony's confidence made her pause. "Show me what you mean," she said. Tony pulled out another piece of paper and began drawing. "Look, in our quantum drive, we have 3 main components. A field generator creates the quantum field. The resonance chamber shapes it, and the projection array directs it. That's all you need for faster-than-light travel. But the mathematics behind those components is incredibly complex," Dr. Campbell protested. "Sure, if you want to understand every detail," Tony agreed. "But if you just want to make it work, you only need to understand the basic relationships between the parts." He pointed to the convergence equation on her data tablet. "The Zephyrians have been trying to solve all 17 variables at once. But what if most of those variables don't matter? What if the equation is just a really complicated way of describing something simple?" Dr. Campbell studied Tony's sketches. Again, his approach was crude and unscientific, but there was something appealing about its simplicity. The Zephyrians had been looking for mathematical perfection, but maybe the universe didn't care about mathematical perfection. "I still don't see how this helps us solve the equation," she said. Tony grinned. "That's because you're still thinking like a mathematician. Think like an engineer instead. Don't ask how to prove it works. Ask how to make it work." While Dr. Campbell struggled with Tony's unconventional approach, Tony himself was back in Engineering Bay 3, surrounded by the humming machinery that kept the USS Endeavour running. He had always been good at fixing things, even when he didn't fully understand how they worked. You listened to the sounds the machine made, watched how it behaved, and figured out what it needed. The convergence equation was just another machine. He thought. A very complicated machine made of mathematics instead of metal, but still just a machine. He pulled out his maintenance checklist and continued working on his simplified version of the equation. The quantum drive nearby provided a constant reference point. Every time he wasn't sure about something, he could look at how the real quantum fields behaved and adjust his calculations accordingly. If this variable represents field strength, he muttered, erasing part of his work and redrawing it, then increasing it should create more curvature in spacetime. And if that's true, then these other variables must be about controlling the direction and stability of the field. He was making connections between abstract mathematics and practical engineering that the Zephyrians had never considered. They had been so focused on theoretical perfection that they had forgotten that the equation was supposed to describe real physical phenomena. Tony's approach was messy and imprecise, but it was also practical. He wasn't trying to create a perfect mathematical proof. He was trying to build something that would work in the real world. As he worked, he began to see patterns in the equation that the Zephyrians had missed. Many of the 17 variables were related to each other in simple ways. Some of them were probably unnecessary duplicates, describing the same physical phenomenon from different mathematical perspectives. You know what? He said to himself, looking at his latest sketch. I think this whole thing can be reduced to maybe 3 or 4 basic relationships. 2 decks above, Dr. Campbell was having her own breakthrough, but of a different kind. She had been trying to approach the convergence equation using traditional human mathematical techniques, but she was running into the same systematic problems that had trapped the Zephyrians. Every time she tried to solve one part of the equation, she created new complications in other parts. The mathematics seemed to fight against itself, creating endless loops of complexity that led nowhere. She was beginning to understand why the Zephyrians had been stuck for 3 centuries. The equation wasn't just difficult to solve. It seemed designed to resist solution through systematic analysis. But Tony's crude sketches had planted an idea in her mind. What if the problem wasn't with their mathematical techniques? What if the problem was with their approach to the equation itself? She pulled up the original equation on her computer screen and began looking at it differently. Instead of seeing it as a mathematical proof to be solved, she tried to see it as Tony did, as a description of how real physical forces behaved in the real world. From this perspective, the equation began to look less like an abstract mathematical concept and more like an overly complicated instruction manual for a machine that should be simple to operate. Maybe Tony's right, she said to herself. Maybe we are making this too complicated. She began experimenting with Tony's approach, trying to identify which variables were truly necessary and which were just mathematical decoration. It was frustrating work, because it went against everything she had been taught about proper scientific method. But as she worked, she began to see the same patterns that Tony had noticed. The equation was describing 3 basic physical relationships, but it was doing so in the most complicated way possible. The next morning, Tony found Dr. Campbell in the mess hall again, but this time she looked excited rather than tired. I've been thinking about what you said, she told him, about making the equation simpler instead of trying to solve it as it is. Tony sat down with his coffee and maintenance checklist. And I think you might be onto something. The Zephyrians have been so focused on mathematical rigor that they've lost sight of what the equation is actually supposed to do. So you want to try my approach? Tony asked. Dr. Campbell nodded. I want to try your approach, but I also want to use proper scientific methods to verify whatever we find. Tony grinned. Deal. But we do it my way first. No systematic analysis until we figure out what we're actually trying to build. As they worked together, combining Tony's practical insights with Dr. Campbell's scientific knowledge, They began to see the convergence equation in a completely new light. It wasn't an impossible mathematical puzzle. It was a description of how to build a machine that could bend space-time. Using quantum energy dot, and like most good machines, it was probably much simpler than it appeared to be. The second day of their visit to Zephyria Prime began with Tony Martinez standing in Dr. Campbell's quarters, holding his maintenance checklist covered in sketches and calculations. He had spent most of the night working on his simplified version of the convergence equation, and he was excited about what he had found. "I think I've got it," he said, spreading his papers across her desk. "Look at this." Dr. Campbell studied his work with growing amazement. Tony had reduced the 17-variable equation to 3 basic relationships. His diagrams showed how quantum fields interacted with spacetime in ways that were both simple and elegant. "This is incredible," she said. "But are you sure it's correct?" Tony shrugged. "There's only one way to find out. We test it." Dr. Campbell felt a moment of doubt. Tony's approach was so different from proper scientific method that it made her nervous. But his confidence was infectious, and his simplified equations did seem to capture the essential physics of the problem. "Okay," she said. "Let's run it through the computer and see what happens." They went to the ship's computer lab, where Dr. Campbell input Tony's simplified equations into the USS Endeavour's quantum drive simulation program. The program was designed to test new configurations of the ship's faster-than-light systems without risking damage to the actual equipment. Tony watched nervously as the computer processed his calculations. He had never used sophisticated simulation software before, and he wasn't sure his rough sketches would translate properly into precise mathematical instructions. "It's working," Dr. Campbell said, staring at the screen in disbelief. "The simulation is showing stable quantum field generation with minimal energy requirements." The results were extraordinary. Tony's simplified version of the equation produced the same faster-than-light effects as the complex Zephyrian formula, but with much greater efficiency and stability. "How is this possible?" Dr. Campbell asked. "The Zephyrians have been working on this problem for centuries." Tony studied the simulation results, comparing them to his hand-drawn diagrams. "I think they were so focused on making the mathematics perfect that they forgot to ask whether it actually worked." "But their approach was so systematic and thorough," Dr. Campbell protested. "Sometimes being thorough is the wrong approach," Tony replied. "Sometimes you just need to understand the basic principles and trust that the universe knows how to do the rest." As they continued testing Tony's solution, Dr. Campbell began to understand something important about the difference between human and Zephyrian thinking. The Zephyrians approached problems by breaking them down into smaller and smaller pieces, analyzing each piece in detail, and then trying to put the pieces back together. But Tony had approached the problem by looking at it as a whole, identifying the essential relationships and ignoring everything else. His solution worked because it matched how the universe actually behaved, not because it was mathematically perfect. "We need to tell Captain Morrison about this," Dr. Campbell said. They found Captain Jake Morrison in his quarters, reviewing diplomatic protocols for their remaining time on Zephyria Prime. When they explained Tony's breakthrough, his reaction was a mixture of excitement and concern. "This is amazing," he said, "but we need to be careful about how we present this to the Zephyrians. They've been working on this problem for their entire civilization's history. We don't want to make them feel embarrassed or inferior." Dr. Campbell nodded. "We should present it as a collaborative effort." Tony's insights combined with their foundational work. But Tony shook his head. "No, that's not right. They need to understand that their approach was the problem, not just the solution. If we don't explain that, they'll just keep making the same mistakes." Captain Morrison considered this. "You're right, but we still need to be diplomatic about it. This could change the relationship between our species." That afternoon, the human delegation requested another meeting with Dr. Veltar Quinn and his team. They returned to the chamber where the convergence equation was displayed, but this time Tony carried his own data tablet loaded with simulation results. "We've been studying your equation," Dr. Campbell began carefully, "and we think we might have found something interesting." Dr. Veltar Quinn and Dr. Mirith Sek looked skeptical. "You have made progress in 2 days that we could not make in 3. Centuries? Not exactly," Tony said, stepping forward. "We didn't solve your equation. We realized that your equation was trying to solve the wrong problem." The Zephyrian scientists looked confused and slightly offended. "What do you mean?" Tony activated his data tablet and projected his simplified diagrams onto the wall next to the complex convergence equation. "You've been treating this as a mathematical proof, but it's actually a description of how quantum fields behave in the real world." He began explaining his approach, showing how the 17 variables could be reduced to 3 basic relationships. As he spoke, he could see the Zephyrians struggling to understand his reasoning. "But where are the systematic proofs?" Dr. Mirith Sek asked. "How do you know these relationships are correct?" "Because they work," Tony replied simply. "Look at the simulation results." Dr. Campbell activated the USS Endeavour's simulation program, showing the stable quantum field generation and efficient faster-than-light travel that Tony's equations produced. The results were undeniable. Dr. Veltar Quinn stared at the simulation in stunned silence. "This is impossible. How can such a simple approach succeed where our sophisticated methods failed?" "Because you were solving the wrong problem," Tony explained. "You were trying to create perfect mathematical proofs, but the universe doesn't care about mathematical perfection. It cares about what actually works." The implications of Tony's breakthrough began to sink in. The Zephyrians had spent centuries pursuing mathematical elegance when they should have been focusing on practical engineering. Their systematic approach, which was their greatest strength, had also been their greatest limitation. "We need to verify these results," Dr. Veltar Quinn said, his voice shaking slightly. "We need to test them with our own equipment." "Of course," Dr. Campbell agreed, "but I think you'll find that Tony's right. Sometimes the most profound discoveries come from understanding the simple truths about how things really work." As the Zephyrian scientists began running their own tests of Tony's solution, Tony Martinez stood quietly in the corner, still holding his maintenance checklist covered in pencil sketches. He had solved a problem that had stumped an entire civilization, not through advanced mathematics or sophisticated analysis, but through simple engineering intuition and practical experience. The universe, it seemed, was more interested in practical solutions than perfect theories. And sometimes the most important breakthroughs came from the most unlikely sources. The great hall of the Zephyrian Academy buzzed with activity as hundreds of scientists worked through the night to verify Tony Martinez's solution. Dr. Veltar Quinn stood before the massive holographic display, watching as his quantum computers processed the simplified equations that had taken a human maintenance engineer just 2 days to develop. "Results are coming in from all testing stations," Dr. Mirith Sek reported, her voice filled with disbelief. "The simplified equation produces stable results in every simulation. Energy requirements are reduced by 60% compared to our previous calculations." Veltar felt a mixture of emotions that he had never experienced before. After 3 centuries of failure, the solution to their greatest challenge had been sitting in front of them all along. But it had taken an outsider with no formal mathematical training to see it. "How many of our assumptions were wrong?" he asked quietly. Mirith consulted her data tablet. "Most of them. The human approach bypasses 14 of our 17 variables. Entirely. They treat them as unnecessary complications rather than essential components." The human delegation had been invited to observe the verification process. Captain Jake Morrison, Dr. Lisa Campbell, and Tony Martinez stood together near the main display, watching as the Zephyrians confirmed what Tony had figured out using simple sketches on a maintenance checklist. "Your people must be proud," Veltar sighed, approaching Tony with something that might have been respect in his large eyes. "To solve in days what we could not solve in centuries." Tony looked uncomfortable with the praise. "I didn't really solve it. I just looked at it differently." "But that is exactly the point," Veltar replied. "We had become so focused on our systematic approach that we could not see the forest for the trees, as you humans say." Dr. Campbell stepped forward. "Your systematic approach wasn't wrong. It was just incomplete. You needed both precision and intuition working together." "Perhaps," Veltar agreed. "But we had forgotten that mathematics is supposed to describe reality, not replace it. We were so concerned with theoretical perfection that we lost sight of practical applications." As the verification tests continued, a remarkable transformation began to take place in the Academy. Young Zephyrian scientists started experimenting with Tony's approach, trying to apply practical engineering principles to other long-standing mathematical problems. Dr. Catherine Naum, a researcher who had been working on quantum communication theory, approached Tony with her own data tablet. "I have been studying your method," she said. "Could you look at this equation and tell me what you see?" Tony studied her holographic display for a few minutes, then began sketching on a piece of paper. "This looks like a signal processing problem. You're trying to send information through quantum entanglement, right?" "Yes, but the signal degrades over long distances," Kethra explained. "We have been trying to solve this through complex error correction algorithms." "What if the problem isn't with error correction?" Tony asked. "What if the problem is that you're trying to send too much information at once?" Within an hour, Tony had helped Kethra reduce her complex quantum communication system to a simple, efficient design that could maintain clear signals across galactic distances. Word of this second breakthrough spread quickly through the Academy. "This is remarkable," Dr. Veltar Quinn told Captain Morrison. "Your engineer has solved two major problems that have challenged us for decades." Captain Morrison smiled. "Tony has always been good at fixing things. I guess it doesn't matter whether it's a quantum drive or a mathematical equation." But the most significant moment came when the final verification tests were complete. The Zephyrian quantum computers confirmed that Tony's solution to the convergence equation was not only correct, but optimal. There was no better way to achieve faster-than-light travel using quantum field manipulation. "We have spent 3 centuries pursuing perfection," Veltar announced to the assembled scientists. "But perfection was not what we needed. We needed understanding." Dr. Campbell approached the main display where Tony's simplified equations glowed, next to the original convergence equation. "The interesting thing is that both equations describe the same physical phenomena. Tony's version is just more honest about what's actually important." "It is more than that," Veltar replied. "It represents a completely different way of thinking about problems. We analyze everything in isolation, but your engineer sees connections and relationships that we miss." Tony Martinez, who had been listening to the conversation, finally spoke up. "I think the real breakthrough isn't the equation. It's that we're working together. You have the systematic analysis that I lack, and I have the practical experience that you need." This observation led to an unprecedented proposal from the Zephyrian Council. Rather than simply sharing Tony's solution, they invited humanity to establish a permanent research partnership. Zephyrian systematic analysis would be combined with human intuition and practical problem-solving. "We have much to learn from each other," Veltar explained to the human delegation. "Your species approaches problems from directions that we would never consider, and perhaps we can help you develop your ideas more systematically." The partnership began immediately. Zephyrian scientists started working alongside human engineers, learning to balance theoretical perfection with practical functionality. Human Researchers gained access to advanced Zephyrian analytical tools and centuries of accumulated knowledge. Tony Martinez found himself at the center of this new collaboration, teaching alien scientists how to think like engineers while learning from them about the deeper mathematical principles behind his intuitive solutions. "I never thought I'd be teaching math to aliens," he told Dr. Campbell during a break in their work. "You're not teaching them math," she replied. "You're teaching them how to think about math differently. That's much more valuable." As the USS Endeavour prepared to depart Zephyria Prime, the Academy looked different than it had just 3 days earlier. The halls that had once echoed with the quiet frustration of centuries-long failure now buzzed with excitement and new possibilities. Tony Martinez stood in the chamber where the convergence equation was displayed, but now his simplified version glowed alongside the original complex formula. Young Zephyrian scientists gathered around both displays, comparing the two approaches and discussing how they could apply similar thinking to other problems. "It is strange," Dr. Veltar Quinn said, joining Tony at the display. "For 300 years, we believed that complexity was a sign of sophistication. Now I see that simplicity can be even more sophisticated." "Both approaches have their place," Tony replied. "You need the complex analysis to understand why something works. But you also need the simple approach to figure out what actually works in the first place." Dr. Mirith Sek approached with a group of young researchers. "We have been discussing your method with the other departments. The physics division wants to apply your approach to their gravity manipulation research. The energy department thinks you could help with their fusion containment problems." Tony looked overwhelmed. "I'm just an engineer. I fix quantum drives and replace worn-out components." "That is exactly why you are valuable," Veltar replied. "You understand how things work in practice, not just in theory." The farewell ceremony was unlike anything in Zephyrian history. Instead of the formal, ritualistic proceedings that usually marked diplomatic visits, it felt more like a celebration of discovery. Scientists from both species exchanged ideas and contact information, planning future collaborations. Captain Morrison addressed the assembled crowd. 3 days ago, we came here to learn about your civilization. We leave having learned something about our own. And we have learned that there are many ways to seek truth," Veltar responded. "Your engineer has shown us that sometimes the most direct path is the best path." As the humans boarded their ship, Tony carried with him a collection of new mathematical problems that the Zephyrians wanted him to examine. Dr. Campbell had been given access to the Academy's complete database of research, and Captain Morrison had signed agreements for ongoing scientific cooperation. But the most important change was not in the exchange of information. It was in the way both species had learned to think about problems. On the flight back to Earth, Tony sat in the mess hall with Dr. Campbell, working on one of the new problems the Zephyrians had given him. It involved quantum computing architecture, and the aliens had been struggling with it for 50 years. "What do you see?" Dr. Campbell asked, watching him sketch on another piece of scrap paper. "It's like a traffic jam," Tony replied. "They're trying to send too much information through. Too few pathways. The solution isn't to build bigger pathways. It's to organize the traffic better." Dr. Campbell smiled. "You make it sound so simple." "Most things are simple once you understand them," Tony said. "The hard part is figuring out what you're really trying to accomplish." 6 months later, the joint Human Zephyrian Research Station was established in neutral space. Scientists from both civilizations worked side by side, combining systematic analysis with intuitive problem-solving. The station's first major breakthrough came when a team of human mechanics and Zephyrian mathematicians solved the galactic communication delay problem by treating it as a plumbing issue rather than a physics challenge. 2.